Well, good morning, everybody over at the warehouse and the fire hall, our friends up in Churchill, and everybody here at the factory. Good morning, welcome here. We're wrapping up our series called Unfinished, and we're about to launch a brand new series next weekend that's perfectly timed to march us right into Easter, so we're looking forward to that. But this morning, as we begin at all of our worship communities, I have a very serious question for you. I want to do a little poll here because you see, it's my conviction that there are two kinds of people. And they're both in this room, and I want you to actually be honest with me enough to tell us what kind of person you are. Now, as you do that, I want to just say no lying, okay? Like just to impress the person next to you, you can't lie. I'm going to ask you for a show of hands, but no lying, okay? So I believe there are two kinds of people. There are roller coaster people and there are non-roller coaster people, okay? So roller coaster people, hands up, where are you? Why do you only have one hand up? You should have both hands up. Roller coaster people, you're amazing, look at you go. All right, non-roller coaster people. Oh, you put up with a little too much enthusiasm there. So if you happen to look over and see my wife Carolyn, she shot her hand up in such a way as to say, you're never getting me on a roller coaster. They were designed by the devil, they're run by the devil, and there's no need to ride a roller coaster. So a few years ago, we were at Canada's Wonderland, and they have a ride there called the Italian Job. You don't really know what it is. And so our whole family was in line, and you can't see what kind of ride it is because it's all in this back lot of a movie set. And so we're partway through the line, and Carolyn starts getting a little nervous, and she turns to the rest of the family and says, "Is this a roller coaster?" And one of my daughters, just as quick as anything, said, "Mom, would we take you on a roller coaster?" Like, there's no way, this is not a roller coaster. And another daughter said, all you get to do is ride in this cool little Austin mini car. You get to drive it. It's so much fun, Mom. You're going to love it. And so we got into the car, and they strapped us in with some pretty heavy-duty seatbelt stuff. And then the buzzer went off, and we shot out of there 65 miles an hour in 3 seconds. 50 feet in the air, down through the flames, through the water, and the whole time people are screaming, but nobody can hear people screaming because there's one voice above them all yelling, "You lied to me!" Well, a few days later, she started talking to us again, which was great. But a number of you would say, you know what, that's not a roller coaster, and I would have to agree with you. It's not a real roller coaster. In fact, let me introduce you to some real, terrifying roller coaster, world record holding roller coasters. The world's fastest roller coaster is a Formula Rosa at Ferrari World Abu Dhabi. Takes you from 0 to a face-stretching 240 kilometers an hour in 4.9 seconds. Yeah, that's a crazy one. The world's tallest is Kinga Ka at Six Flags in New Jersey. It takes you 456 feet straight up in the air and then 456 feet straight down. And that's the world's tallest. The one with the most inversions is the Smiler in England. It takes you on a stomach turning 14 high-speed inversions. And the longest is the Steel Dragon in Japan, a whopping 2.5 kilometers long. Those are roller coasters. Now, this last week, as we were reading in the book of Nehemiah, I think we may have come across the world's oldest roller coaster. Now, some of you are brand new with us. Every week we have people brand new with us. I want to welcome you here. It's so great to have you. I like to tell you where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And so where we've been is about 2.5 months ago. Our senior leaders were praying together and retreating together, and we felt like we heard the thunderous voice of God saying, I want you to scrap your plans for the next 6 months, and I want you to do something different. And that something different was what we're calling a chapter a day. In fact, it wasn't for 6 months, it's for the next 3 years. And we just felt like God was calling us to battle back against biblical illiteracy and to get into the Word of God and to call every single Riverwooder to be in their Bible for 10 minutes a day, reading a chapter a day. Now, that sounds easy enough, but it's actually sort of like an onion. And so there's different layers to this. So the first layer of the onion is to actually read a chapter a day. The second layer, getting a little deeper, what we're helping you with is we're giving you bookmarks. We gave you an app. You can listen on the app or you can read on the app. The website also has a whole bunch of resources on there. Aside from the app, we've also provided you with these videos, the Bible Project, which is like an 8-minute summary video beginning each book. So you actually get some education in knowing what this book is all about. As we move in a little bit deeper, or actually we have the Declare Yourself button. The Declare Yourself button is an opportunity for you to hit a button on our website or on the app saying, I'm committed. Sometimes you just need to make that commitment. And so I am so thrilled that 648 Riverwooders have said, I will read a chapter a day. I'm not going to let up on this till we get 1,000. I think there's 1,000 of us that need to be declaring ourselves that we are going to read a chapter a day. Then we got these, we've got these videos. I've committed to blogging a short little devotional every single day for the next 1,000 days so that I blog at every single chapter of the Bible. So some of you are meeting me in blogosphere, and we're having a great time there. Then every weekend, we're going to teach out what we learned. For the next 3 years, we're going to teach our way through the entire Bible and teach what we learned from that week. And then at the very core of this thing is by the end of it, that you will be able to say, I have read all 1,189 chapters of the Bible. I did it in 1,000 days in 3 years. I've spent 3 years of my life setting this pattern of 10 minutes a day, 5 minutes reading the Word of God, and 5 minutes saying, God, speak to me through your Word. We think that this will strengthen our faith and will strengthen our church. That's where we've been. And so we've been picking up the book of Ezra and Nehemiah in the last few weeks. In fact, we're on day 60 tomorrow. We're moving into book number 9 tomorrow, so we're really making some great progress. And we're into the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, wrapping that up today. Now, this happens about 400 or 500 years before Christ. The Israelites have been carried off because of their disobedience into Babylonian captivity, and they've won some favor with the king, so they've come back to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. Ezra helps with that, and then Nehemiah leads the rebuilding of the walls. And something, I don't know, it's only 23 chapters long, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, but if you've been reading through, I'm sure your heart has been stirred at different times with their determination and their unity. They're focused on purpose. These are people that are all in. I mean, they are all in. They are building with one hand. They got a weapon in the hand with the other to defend the city. They're each instructed in front of their home to build that piece of the wall and to guard that piece of the wall. There's a tremendous amount of unity. And then in chapter 9 that we read this last week, we begin to see the pieces of the roller coaster being laid out. And here's how it comes. It's a prayer, it's a summary of how God has worked in the nation of Israel over the years. And as they begin to recount how God has worked in the nation of Israel, we begin to read words like this. They say, you know what, God, you created us. God, you created us and you came close to us. You wanted a relationship with us. God, you have been so faithful to us. God, you have rescued us, you protected us, you provided for us, and their relationship is beginning to grow. God, you instructed us, you fed us, you chose us, you blessed us. And by the end of this little run, you see that, oh my goodness, their relationship and intimacy and closeness with God is up and to the right. Things are going so well. They've got this great dynamic going on. And then we read verse 16, But our ancestors were proud and stubborn, and they paid no attention to your commands. And suddenly, they take this nosedive, and their relationship with God and their connectedness to God takes a terrible nosedive, and they're back down in the valley of slavery. So what is God's response going to be to this disobedience? How is God going to respond to this horrible turn of events? Well, we find out that God forgives them, and God is gracious to them. And God shows mercy to them, and he is slow to anger. I'm getting this right out of the text. God says, I will not abandon you. And he gives them purpose. He protects them. He gives them victory. He shows them unmerited and unconditional love, and he helps them conquer their enemies. They're right back up there. Their relationship is pumping. Things are going so well. And then we read verse 26, But despite all this, they were disobedient and rebelled against you. They turned their backs on your law. And boom! They're back into slavery. They're back into tough times. They're back at the bottom of this valley. And so what do you do when you have turned your back on God and you're at the bottom of a valley? You cry out. You go, oh, God, would you forgive me? I can't believe I did that. Would you please forgive me? Would you please restore me? And what is God's response going to be? Well, God hears their pleas. It says in the Word that God was merciful. He's kind and gentle. He forgives them. He begins to break the bonds of slavery. And then we come to verse 28. But As soon as they were at peace, your people again committed evil in your sight, and once more you let their enemies conquer them. Boom, they're back down at the bottom. I mean, how many times is this going to go on? So they cry out for mercy. Oh, God, we were so stupid. I can't believe we made that mistake again. Would you please forgive us? Would you please have mercy on us? And what is God's response going to be? It says that God has mercy. He is patient with them. He forgives them. He makes them strong again. And he restores them, and he causes them to soar to new heights. And then we read in verse 29, but they became proud and obstinate and disobeyed your commands. They stubbornly turned their backs on you and refused to listen, and they're back down at the bottom again. How many times is God going to forgive them? How many times is God going to have mercy on them? How many times is he going to be gracious to them? What is he going to do this time? Well, it says in the Word that God is patient with them for many years, and then he sends his Spirit to minister to them through prophets. It says that he is merciful. He does not abandon them. He woos them back into relationship. He lays out a fertile land before them. And then verse 35, but they refuse to turn from their wickedness. So now today we are slaves. We serve our captors. And as you look at this history of Israel, you can't help but get sick to your stomach. You get queasy. I mean, this is like motion sickness, up and down and up and down and up and down. God's graciousness and then their crazy mistakes. But finally, as we move to chapter 10, I'm glad to announce, as we move to chapter 10, they finally get it. They finally begin to mature. They make some right decisions, and now they put some things in place that are going to grow their faith, and it is absolutely a remarkable read as we read through chapter 10 this last week. Let me sort of just highlight for you some of the points here. Verse 29, they solemnly promised to carefully follow all the commands and regulations and decrees of the Lord their God. They drew a line in the sand. They hit the I'm in, I'm committed button, and they said, you know what? We are going to follow God. That's it. We're done with doing this disobedient stuff on our own. We're actually going to follow God. And then it goes on in verse 38. It says this, we promise not to let our daughters marry the pagan people of the land and not to let our sons marry their daughters. This wasn't a racist thing. This was simply, we're not going to get hooked up with people that are going to draw us away from God. We're going to obey your commands, and they continue to grow. And now they're on a roll. Verse 31, we also promise that if people bring goods to be sold on the Sabbath, we will refuse to buy them. This was one of their Sabbath laws. It's not one of our Sabbath laws, but it's one of their Sabbath laws. And so they said, you know what, we're going to obey that law. We're going to take that seriously. Verse 32, in addition, we promise to obey the command to pay the annual temple tax. Now their commitment is reaching right into their checkbook and their bank account. It's getting into the most practical of places. And they're saying, you know what? We are going to follow this up with a lot of practicality from our careers and our work and our resources. We are going to obey God. Verse 35, it says, we promise to bring the first fruit of every harvest to the Lord's temple year after year. And then in verse 37, and we promise also we will take to the Levites who collect tithes of our farming villages, the tithes from the crops that grow in our land. And then they make one final declaration and announcement to kind of cover everything, to make sure that they're all in. Verse 39, we promise together not to neglect the temple of our God. Wow, after this crazy roller coaster ride of faith over all these years, they now come to the place where they're growing, they're mature. They're actually following the Lord. Their relationship with God is pumping and it's running on all cylinders. Things could not have been better. So Nehemiah looks at this and he says, well, you know what? This is a good time for me to go back and fulfill my commitment to King Artaxerxes of Babylon. I promised I would come back to Babylon. So he goes back to Babylon because they're all in good shape. They've never had a better relationship with God than they do at this moment. So now he goes back to Babylon, and in chapter 13, he returns, and the impossible has happened. In chapter 13, all of their commitment, all of their dedication, all of their promises, all of their maturity, all of their growing close to God has now begun to drift. And we're going to focus the rest of our time just on chapter 13. Because in chapter 13, Nehemiah identifies 4 ways that the Israelites drifted from God. And I want to name them out for you. Here's the first one. They drifted in their worship. It's a little bit of a story in the first few verses. There's a priest who's in charge of running the temple storehouses. What he does is he takes all the sacred items from the temple storehouse and he clears them out, puts them in some corner closet, and he allows Tobiah to move in and run his business from this temple storehouse. He leases this temple storehouse to Tobiah. And we sit there and go, oh, it doesn't mean much to me. It doesn't sound like a very big deal. But that's because we don't know who Tobiah is. You might not remember. Tobiah is an Ammonite. He's not an Israelite. He's from a foreign nation. He's an Ammonite governor who, back in Ezra and Nehemiah earlier in the books, was actually trying to undermine and try to threaten and manipulate and stop the building of the temple and the walls in Jerusalem. He was strategically against all of this building stuff. But what he manages to do is he manages to marry a Jewish woman, and his son marries a Jewish woman. So now he uses those connections, he weasels his way in, and he actually gets the priest to move the sacred items out of the storehouse so that he can lease it and set up a business, a secular business in the storehouse. And when Nehemiah returns, he is shocked at how lax and how casual the people's approach towards the sacred has become. And here's the takeaway for us. If you want to know or assess for your own life, is my life on a trajectory where I'm growing in intimacy and connectedness to God, or am I actually turning downward and beginning to coast down to a dangerous place? If you want to assess where you are at, ask yourself this question: has my worship drifted? Has my worship drifted? Has what used to be set aside as being sacred now become something for the world? That space in my heart that used to be reserved for the sacred parts of God, have I actually moved in, lease free, something of the world to take up that space? Has worship become something that I have traded out and now the world has taken that place? You know, one of the biggest problems I have with worship these days is that most of us kind of have this idea that worship is fueled by emotion and sentiment. We kind of think that the biggest fuel of worship is if I'm emotionally excited or feel drawn into it. And what happens is we come to worship together and we don't necessarily feel fueled up or excited, so therefore we don't enter in. And when you don't enter in, you just are sort of going through the motions. You go through the motions and it becomes a hollow ritual long enough and you stop showing up. But listen, you know, a lot of you would know that I am committed to this chapter a day thing. And maybe you're sitting there and you think, wow, you're a pastor. You probably just can't wait to wake up at 5 a.m. and open your Bible and read a chapter a day. You're probably so excited when you wake up and do that. And you know that I'm committed to blogging every day for 1,000 days on every chapter in the Bible. And maybe you sit there and go, wow, I bet when you sit down to type, you just can't type fast enough because you're so excited to be meeting with God and to be writing those words out. And I got to tell you that I am committed in my family and in my relationships to bear with people, to forgive people, to ask forgiveness and be humble when I need to be teachable and follow those New Testament commands. And you might sit there and say, I bet that just comes out of an excitement to just marshal those disciplines in your life and just worship God that way. And maybe you sit there and maybe you see somebody in your row lifting their hands in worship, or maybe you've seen me lift my hands in worship. And you might sit there and go, wow, you must be having such an emotional, sentimental, connecting moment with God. Are you kidding me? Like, seriously, is that what you're thinking? Because none of those come out of sentiment or emotion. In fact, I would tell you that when I personally enter into worship and I am bellowing the words to God and I'm raising my hands, about 5% of the time it's fueled by emotion. 95% of the time it's fueled by hard work. It's fueled by choice. It's fueled for me by a mathematical equation that says, God, you are greater than I am, and you are greater than anything in my life. God, there is no equal to you. God, there is nothing that can add to your holiness. There's nothing that can subtract from your goodness. It's a mathematical equation, and I sit there at the end and say, so therefore, you are greater and you deserve the best of my time, the best of my energy, the best of my words, the best of my posture, the best of my heart attitude, and I will work it. I will work it. I will choose to worship you, and I will work it, and I will focus, and I will discipline myself, and I will remember that you are God and I am not, and that is worship. But when you sit there and think that worship is motivated and fueled by emotion, you're not going to feel enough emotion to fuel your worship. And so we need to stop and simply allow our worship to be worked out. And Nehemiah, I think he's saying, look at, what are you going to do? Are you going to allow those sacred spaces to be taken over, or will you actually put what's sacred in its right place? Now, there's a second indicator of drift, and that is, he says this, he says, their giving drifted. In Nehemiah chapter 13, verses 10 to 14, we read how Nehemiah comes back, and what he discovers is that the temple is empty. There's no priests there. There's no temple workers there. Then he goes looking for them, and he finds them out tilling their fields and working their fields for money. And he comes back and he literally says, and I'm not making this up, he literally says, people, come on, it's time to tithe again. Now, I know some of you right now in your posture, inside your heart are going, whoa, are we really going to go there? Are we really going to talk the money talk? Listen, I love that about this going through the Bible thing, is I don't set what we're going to talk about. It's there for us. You cannot escape the fact that through Ezra and Nehemiah, 20 times in 23 chapters, this whole value of tithing and free will offering and giving keeps coming up. It's something that keeps coming up. And if you want to know a second indicator of whether your relationship is growing in intimacy and commitment or you're beginning to drift and go downward, is if your giving is drifting. It's not about money, it's about your heart. Is your giving drifting? I realize this is going to be a little bit of a hard pill for some of us to swallow, but we need to go there because Nehemiah goes there. And so I want to give you actually over the next few minutes a crash course in tithing. Some of you have heard the word, but you don't know what it really means or what's involved. So let me give you a crash course. So brace yourself, here we go. What is tithing? It means giving the first 10% of your income, what's called the first fruits, the very best, right off the top, to God in worship. Is it net or gross? Yes. How many Christians actually tithe? 10 to 15%. The latest studies say 10 to 15% of Christians actually tithe. Will I go to hell if I don't tithe? No. Will I go to heaven if I do tithe? No. So why tithe? Well, first of all, the Bible teaches tithing. Secondly, it's one of the best indicators for yourself and for God. Notice, for yourself and for God. Not for me, not for our elders, not for our finance committee, not for anybody at our church. Nobody knows what you give. I don't know what you give. None of the elders know what you give. Even the people that enter the data, we erase their memories at the end of every day, so they don't even know what you give, okay? Nobody cares what you give. This is totally between you and God. But tithing is a fantastic indicator for yourself and for God of who you trust. It's a great indicator. We can use words, we can show up at church, we can do all the stuff, but nothing speaks so loud as taking the top 10% of your income and saying, God, I'm going to trust you with this. Thirdly, you need to know that it's very, very difficult to say, God, I love you. God, I trust you. God, my mind is set on heavenly things. I am all about your priorities. I realize that you have given me everything, and I give everything back to you. My whole life is yours. Just don't touch my money. I'm not satisfied with you providing me with everything and me only having 90% to work with. No, I need the 100%. You get zero. It's really, really hard to posture your life in worship and realize that God has given you everything you have, and to say, you know what? You get none of it back. Do pastors tithe? Your pastors, your elders, and your church staff tithe, and the covenant community are signed on and committed to tithing. Your pastors and your elders and your church staff will lead by example, and they will practice what they preach. And so, yes, we tithe. If I wanted to, let's go back. Actually, let's go back to this whole idea of the Old Testament. The Old Testament law doesn't teach tithing or teaches tithing, but we're not under the Old Testament law, so I don't have to tithe, right? True. The Old Testament law teaches tithing, but we are not under that law. So you do not need to tithe. Absolutely, you do not need to tithe. It's not a law, it's not a requirement. In the Old Testament, we find that there are 3 different tithes amounting to 20 to 27%, and those tithes are actually for temple upkeep, for the priests, for national operations, as well as for welfare. The Old Testament is heavy on teaching about tithing, but it does not appear in the New Testament except for one place where Jesus teaches. So Jesus didn't teach tithing, therefore I don't need to tithe, right? Right. Jesus did not teach tithing. There's only one place that he even affirmed tithing, and that was in Matthew 23:23. Otherwise, Jesus did not teach tithing. Do you know why Jesus didn't teach tithing? Because it wasn't enough. Because giving 10% to Jesus was way too easy, and it was way too little. If you read Jesus, you realize that Jesus regularly advocated for us giving more than 10%. Well, shouldn't I take care of my credit card debts and my mortgage and all that stuff and just give what I happen to have at the end to God? You will never have extra. That is not first fruits. That is skimpy leftovers, and you're not going to have any. And so what I would encourage you to do is put your heart in the right place by beginning to give, even if it's not the tithe, beginning to give while you get yourself worked out of debt and lower your debt and increase your giving. Work on a discipline of doing that. I already mentioned to the pastor's tithe. Okay, if I wanted to start tithing or growing in tithing, how would I go about that? Number one, you need a budget. Experts tell us that as soon as you put a budget in place, you automatically save 10%. There's your 10% right there. Carolyn and I have been working on a budget for decades. And our very top line, I can show it to you, the very top line in our budget is God tithe, right off the top. And then we adjust the rest of our lives accordingly, and we learn to live off of that. That's just a great way to order your life. So I would encourage you to set that at the top of your budget. Now, if you're struggling financially, maybe don't start with the 10%. Start with 3%, with a heart to move it to 4%, with a heart to move it to 7%, with a heart to move it to a full tithe, so you're bringing a full tithe to God. But again, this is between you and God. Nobody else is going to know. Nobody else cares. This is a very, very personal thing between you and God. Now, how do you practically get started? Well, I want to encourage you to maybe take up what I'm starting today, calling it a 90-day tithing challenge. I'm issuing a 90-day tithing challenge today. For those of you that have never practiced giving and you've never practiced tithing, I want to challenge you for the next 3 months, for April, May, and June, to begin to tithe, to begin to exercise that giving muscle. What I love about this is it's risky, but it's not without a safety net. It's not that you're committing yourself to a lifetime of tithing. It's just 3 months. But here's what's going to happen. I know what's going to happen. You're going to bring your gift. You're going to set it on the table, and you're going to think that that's all that's happening. But what you don't realize is that God is going to meet you there. And there are going to be things that happen in your spirit that you could have never anticipated, because now your faith is going to be sparked to life in a brand new way. And your trust is going to be sparked to life. And your discipline is going to be sparked to life. And you're going to find that you're meeting God in a powerful way, and He's not going to leave you hanging. He's going to show up there, and by the end of that, you're going to go, oh my goodness, I think I just took my faith to a new level. I think I've grown spiritually. It's not about money. It's about your heart, and it's about your spirit. So if you want to practically do this, how do you do it? We have 6 different giving ways at Riverwood. So simple. There's the website and PayPal on the website, the traditional envelope and offering basket. We have POS machines and giving stations in the foyer. We have Interact e-transfers. I was talking to somebody the other day, and I mentioned this, and they said, what? How come you didn't tell me that we have e-transfers? And right there in front of me, they gave. And they were just so excited about e-transfers. So for those of you that get excited about e-transfers, you can do that. Set up an automatic withdrawal. That's what Carolyn and I have done for years. It just comes right off the top. You can use that offering envelope to do that, and then directly off the Riverwood app. Here's the bottom line. Most of us do not give because of fear. We're afraid. We're afraid that we're not going to have enough. We're afraid that God might not show up in the midst of this and help us out. We're afraid of taking that first step. And I want to tell you, God has not given us a spirit of fear, but He has given you a spirit of faith and a sound mind and discipline, and He would love to meet you in the middle of this. Okay, moving on. So Nehemiah identifies that they had drifted in their worship. They had turned what was sacred into secular. They had drifted in their giving, and now they were keeping it all for themselves instead of giving it to God. Thirdly, they had drifted in their obedience, verses 15 to 22. Now, the particular law that they were breaking is that they were doing purchasing on the Sabbath. This was against the law. The Jewish people had 39 different ways that they were prohibited from doing activities on the Sabbath, and they were breaking one. So Nehemiah calls them on it. It says, look, you are breaking the law here. Now, we don't live under that same law. In fact, I know a lot of Christians will say, you know what, our poor Jewish cousins, those poor suckers, they have 613 Torah laws that they have to keep. And I'm not under the law. I'm under grace. I'm free. I'm a New Testament Christian. I am so free, I'm not under the law. And that is wonderful. That's a great realization that you are free. Here's something you need to know from the New Testament. Listen to this. It is absolutely clear that God has called you to a free life. Just make sure that you don't use your freedom as an excuse to do whatever you want and destroy your freedom. Rather, use your freedom to serve one another in love. We're not under the law. We do not have to follow all that stuff. But does that mean we have a license to do anything we want? No, there's still obedience that we're called to. And I realize that obedience and commands are not very vogue words these days, but God still calls us as Christ followers to obedience. You know, when it comes to the Jewish laws, we know that there are 613 Old Testament laws that the people needed to keep. Let me ask you this question. How many New Testament commands are there? And how many of them did Jesus utter? How many of those did he say? I want you to turn to the person next to you at all of our worship venues right now. Show them how smart you are and tell them how many New Testament commands there are and how many of them were from Jesus. Go for it. Okay, there's a lot of muttering going on here. Come on, I want some energy. Tell them how many there are. All right. 613 commands from our poor Jewish cousins. How many New Testament commands? Somebody has counted out 1,050. Now, there's a number of duplicates there, so it actually comes down to 800 unique ones, 335 of them from Jesus. Let me ask you this question. As a committed follower of Jesus Christ, you have said, I am here to walk with Jesus and obey his commands. Do you even know what they are? Do you know what they are? How many of us have said, no, I'm under grace. I can do whatever I want. I'm free from the law. Yes, you are. You are under grace and you are free from the law. But because we love Jesus so much, we say, I will follow your commands. But do you even know what they are? There's no wiggle room on this. We need to be a people who know what God has said, and we do what God has said. And what we find Nehemiah saying is, look, you want to know whether your relationship is growing and taking off or whether it's beginning to nosedive? Take a look at your own life, whether you are obeying Christ or you're not obeying him. One last one, their personal morality began to drift. Behind closed doors, in the intimacy of their personal relationships, they were compromising. What we know is that they were marrying people outside of the Jewish nation, and Nehemiah called them on this. Kirsten did a great job last weekend of letting us know this wasn't a racist issue, it wasn't a nationality issue, it wasn't a foreign refugee issue. What this was that the people were climbing into bed with people who didn't love God, and these people were drawing them away from God. And so what we end up with at the end of chapter 13 is not a pretty picture. We find that the Israelites are right back where they started. They've ridden this crazy roller coaster up and down, up and down, up and down, and they have not paid attention to their lives, and they've drifted from God, and they end up at the end of the book with one of the most sad commentaries. They're right down back at the bottom, and they haven't grown a bit. So what are we supposed to take away from this? Well, first of all, I would take away this. Those who aren't worried about drift probably are. Those who are not worried about drift are probably drifting. How many of us get lulled into this idea, hey, I've been a Christ follower for 17 years. I've been a Christ follower for 32 years. I've been a Christ follower for 48 years. Big deal. Are you guarding your faith? Because you see, every one of us is susceptible to drift, no matter how long you have been in the faith. Every one of us is susceptible to drift. And you need to monitor that. And so Nehemiah gives us 4 powerful ways. Number 2, Nehemiah gives us 4 powerful ways to assess drift. Is my worship drifting? Have I started replacing the sacred with the secular? Is my giving drifted? If my giving is a projection of my true faith and love and trust for God, what am I projecting on the walls of heaven with my giving? Or has materialism and consumerism and self-centeredness got me? And do I need to make some bold and gutsy moves and take up the tithing challenge? Has my obedience drifted? Have I gotten so used to living in freedom that I just do everything the world's doing and say, oh, I'm under grace, I'm under grace? Or do I actually follow through and obey what Christ has called me to do? And have my personal morals began to drift? And then number 3, it starts with a but it ends with a scream. I can't even begin to tell you as a pastor how many people I have talked to, hundreds, literally hundreds of people, who have said, you know what, I was once growing with God and my relationship with God was so great. And I was so close to God and I was maturing in my faith. But then I was introduced to this little compromise. I was enticed with this little exception, this little excuse, and it always started with a but. Oh God, I know you want me to do this, but I'd rather do this. God, I know you call me to this, but I'd rather go my own way. And I took that step, and it began to turn my relationship. And then partway down, or right near the bottom, I realized that the forces that had enticed me into that, they had lied to me, and I found myself screaming, you lied to me! Because they will never fulfill what they promised. Those little enticements, those little excuses, they're there to pull you away from Christ. They're there to cause you to compromise. And so I'm laying down the gauntlet today, and I'm laying down the challenge, and I'm asking you straight up, has your worship drifted? Has your giving drifted? Have you drifted in your obedience? Have you drifted in your personal morality where it's behind closed doors and nobody else sees, but it's between you and God? Because my goal or my desire is that you would be growing and growing and growing and growing. And you might have a little dip and you might have a little falter, but then I trust that you won't go all the way down, that you'll keep growing and growing and growing. This is what God calls us to. At all of our worship communities, we just stand and we're just going to commit ourselves in a word of prayer and ask God to do some stuff that only He can do. Let's pray together. Oh God, thank you for your word. Thank you for every single day when we pick up the Bible and we open that chapter, you are so poised and ready to speak to us. And you speak to us all differently. You draw different things out of the passage, but you're ready to do that. And God, I pray that you would move us from 648 to 750 to 800 to 1,000 people, all being unified in purpose, saying we all want to follow in step of God. Now, God, I pray today, I know that you have pushed some buttons in our hearts, and I know some of us have felt a little uncomfortable. God, I pray against guilt. I pray against shame. I pray against those thoughts that come to us to say, oh, see, I told you, you're just a failure. You're no good at this. God, I pray for faith. I pray for gutsy faith that we would be willing to follow where you are leading and watch the miracles follow. I know you won't leave us hanging. I know you will meet us in the middle of that. So God, some of us have some decisions to make today. And I pray that our worship, maybe it's going to happen long after this service closes. I pray that our worship would be solid and true, and it would take us to new heights with you, because you're such an amazing God, and we love you. In Jesus' name, and all the people said, amen. I'm going to release all our worship communities. Let's respond in prayer together.